Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee at 2 a.m. Danielle Ross moves through the fluorescent-lit ER with invisible competence, her dark hair pulled tight in a bun that sits like a fist at the base of her skull. She wears compression sleeves under her scrubs, not fashionable, not trendy, the kind that stabilize old shoulder injuries no one asks about. Her hands are steady as surgical lasers as she hangs a fresh fur bag, checks the drip rate, adjusts the flow without hesitation. The left leg has a slight limp she never explains, barely perceptible unless you're looking, and tonight nobody is looking because that's exactly how Danielle prefers it. She keeps a cardboard box under her locker in the break room. A cracked mug that says "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A dying succulent with brown tips curling inward like a secret. A photograph of 12 soldiers in desert camo standing in front of a damaged Humvee, the Tikrit skyline burning behind them, half their faces marked with small black X's drawn carefully in permanent marker. Her hands never shake during procedures, for starts, catheter placements, drawing labs from the most difficult veins, but they tremble slightly when she signs her own name on the timesheet, as if her signature itself is something dangerous that needs containment. The night shift at Sacred Heart runs from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 52 weeks a year, same rotation, same patient cycling through trauma and recovery and the long slow descent into goodbye. Danielle has worked this floor for 4 years, and in that time she has learned to be the kind of nurse people forget 10 seconds after she leaves the room. No one asks her personal questions. No one invites her to happy hour. The other nurses, Jasmine and Marcus and Patricia, all warm and chatty and possessed of the kind of lightness that comes from having nothing to hide, they've stopped trying to include her in their conversations. They've learned that Danielle responds in single words. Good. Fine. Later. She speaks only when a patient needs something, and then her voice drops to a frequency that carries absolute authority without raising in volume. Tonight the ER is running at 60% capacity, which means beds open, which means relative calm, which means Dr. Hargrove has time to notice things he shouldn't notice. He arrives for his 10 p.m. rounds with his Rolex catching the overhead lights, a watch that costs more than Danielle's annual salary, $28,000 a year, before taxes. His suit is charcoal with a subtle purple pinstripe, the kind of suit that whispers rather than shouts, which is exactly how money behaves when there's enough of it. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, age 52, divorced twice, with a sailboat named Catalyst and a reputation for being exceptional with hospital administrators but cruel to everyone else. He stops at the central station where Danielle is finishing her charting, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she uses for everything else. She's documenting a patient from bed 3, a 64-year-old male admitted with chest pain, ruled out for MI, awaiting discharge. Her notes are surgical in their specificity. Patient denies dyspnea. Cardiac enzymes negative at 0 and 3 hours. EKG shows normal sinus rhythm. Vitals stable throughout observation period. Pain resolved with acetaminophen and rest. Patient alert and oriented ×3, expressing understanding of discharge instructions. Hargrove reads the note over her shoulder without asking permission. His jaw tightens almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-expression that crosses someone's face when they encounter a problem they didn't expect to find. He's been billing Sacred Heart's patient accounts with supply orders that don't exist, 25-count boxes of surgical instruments that never arrived, phantom procedures coded to real patients, a careful architecture of fraud that has netted him approximately $470,000 over the past 18 months. The billing discrepancies are microscopic, hidden in the volume of legitimate charges, but Danielle's charting is so precise, so unfailingly accurate in its documentation of exactly what was used and exactly what wasn't, that she's caught 2 inconsistencies already. 2 small ones. The kind that would be nothing alone but would become something very quickly if someone kept digging. He smiles, but it's the smile of a predator who just identified a competitor for resources. Thorough work, Danielle. Very detailed. The way he says her name makes it sound like an accusation. Just standard documentation, doctor. Her voice is polite, deferential, the voice of someone who has learned that speaking less prevents problems. She doesn't look up from the screen. Some might say overly detailed. meticulous to the point of obsession. He leans against the counter, the kind of casual lean that takes up space and demands attention. Have you ever considered that excessive documentation can actually slow down the workflow? Create bottlenecks. The Joint Commission requires. I'm aware of what the Joint Commission requires. I wrote a good portion of our compliance manual. He taps a finger on the desk, once, twice, 3 times, a rhythm like a countdown. I'm just thinking that someone with your attention to detail might be better suited to administrative work. Less patient contact. More paperwork. More time to document everything to death. Danielle's hand stopped moving. In her periphery, she can see Jasmine at bed 5, suddenly very focused on her own charting, suddenly very interested in not witnessing whatever this is. The ER goes very quiet. The ventilator in bed 3 continues its mechanical wheeze, the sound of air moving through plastic tubing, the sound of life being managed by machine. A monitor beeps somewhere down the hallway. Someone's call bell chimes, 3 times, patient impatient. She closes the computer without saving, moves to stand, and Hargrove steps closer to block her path in the most subtle way possible. Not aggressive. Not threatening in any provable way. Just the physics of power and space. You know what concerns me about you, Danielle. He's using her first name again, like they're friends, like they're colleagues. You're competent. Almost too competent. It makes other people nervous. Some of the staff have mentioned to me that you seem cold. Unfriendly. Unwilling to be a team player. She still doesn't look at his face. Her eyes track to his Rolex instead, watching the second hand move with mechanical perfection. I follow protocols, doctor. I care for patients. That's my role. Your role is to follow my directives. To be part of a team that functions according to my standards. Not to operate in some kind of private bubble, silently judging everyone around you. His voice is still pleasant, still controlled, but there's an edge now, the sound of someone testing to see how far they can push. I'm going to need you to consider what I've said about the administrative track. We'll discuss it more formally next week. Danielle moves sideways, her hip brushing against the counter, creating just enough space to slip past him without making it a confrontation. She doesn't respond because responding would create a record, a witness, a comment that could be repeated. She simply moves toward bed 4, where Mrs. Chen is waiting for her blood pressure to be rechecked, and Hargrove watches her go with the expression of someone who has just confirmed what he already suspected. The girl is a threat. The girl is better than she should be. The girl, with her precise hands and her perfect documentation and her absolute refusal to acknowledge his authority as anything more than procedural, is exactly the kind of person who brings down men like him. What Hargrove doesn't see is the way Danielle's jaw clenches as she wraps the blood pressure cuff around Mrs. Chen's arm. What he doesn't see is the scar tissue across her shoulders, pale and thick, visible only when she changes scrubs in the locker room at shift change, the kind of scarring that comes from significant thermal or ballistic trauma. What he doesn't see is the photograph under the cardboard box's false bottom, a different photograph from the one visible on top. Danielle in dress blues, standing at attention between 2 commanding officers, her chest covered in medals arranged in strict order of precedence, her face younger but somehow already carrying the weight of things civilians never see. What Hargrove doesn't understand is that Danielle Ross isn't someone to push. Danielle Ross is someone to not notice at all. Danielle Ross should be the nurse you forget the moment she leaves the room. But Hargrove is a man who has spent 23 years in medicine learning to bend rules, and he has developed an instinct for spotting people who might bend them differently than he does. He sees Danielle's competence and translates it as insubordination. He sees her silence and translates it as judgment. He sees the way she moves through his ER with absolute certainty and thinks, this one will be easy to destroy. Mrs. Chen's blood pressure reads 118/76. Normal. Perfect. Danielle removes the cuff and makes a notation in the electronic chart. One of her notes, just like all her notes, accurate, complete, utterly unhelpful to anyone trying to hide something. She walks toward the medication room to check on a discharge order, and Hargrove remains at the central station, already opening his secure email on his personal phone, already drafting messages to certain people who owe him favors. By the time Danielle finishes her shift at 7 a.m., the machinery of her own destruction will already be spinning. But that's still 6 hours away. For now, there is only the fluorescent hum of the ER at night, only the steady beep of monitors and the occasional voice paging a doctor, only Danielle moving through her shift with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned that being seen is the most dangerous thing a person can be. Mrs. Chen falls asleep in bed 4. The ventilator in bed 3 continues its mechanical rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, a patient calls out for a nurse, and Danielle is already moving toward the sound before the call button has finished chiming. Hargrove watches from the central station, his Rolex ticking through seconds that feel very much like a countdown to something neither of them yet fully understands. The night shift continues. The ER breathes like a living thing. And Danielle Ross, whose records were erased 6 months ago from every military database that mattered, who was ordered to disappear into civilian life and never speak of what she did in Tikrit and the missions after, who carries a unit patch sewn into her jacket lining as the only proof she ever served at all, Danielle keeps charting, keeps documenting, keeps doing everything exactly right while Dr. Hargrove begins to methodically plan how to make her disappear again, this time into unemployment, into disgrace, into the kind of professional obliteration that feels like justice to men who traffic in secrets. The veteran coded at 2:14 a.m. Harold Chen, 68 years old, retired Marine Corps mechanic, brought in by his daughter screaming that he'd collapsed in the driveway and his stomach felt wrong. The ER nurse who triaged him, not Danielle, heard abdominal pain and marked it routine. By the time Danielle reached bed 7, his blood pressure was 60/40 and dropping like a stone. She saw it immediately. The ashen skin. The rapid shallow breathing. The way his eyes had started that glassy distant thing that meant his body was shutting down system by system. The monitor screamed at her, tachycardia climbing past 140. Oxygen saturation tanking. And when she pressed her fingers into his abdomen, she felt the rigidity, the internal rebellion of organs bleeding out behind muscle and fascia. "Get me the ultrasound," she said. Not a request. A command. The other nurses looked at her. She wasn't the charge nurse. She wasn't even registered to order equipment. But her voice had dropped an octave, and something in her posture, something that had nothing to do with Portland General Hospital and everything to do with a rooftop in Fallujah where a colleague had bled out because she'd been 2 minutes too slow, made them move. The ultrasound showed it. Massive hemopericardium. Blood pooling around his heart, compressing it, squeezing it like a fist closing. Cardiac tamponade. The kind of injury that kills in minutes if you don't intervene. If you wait for authorization. If you follow the chain of command while a man dies in front of his daughter. Danielle's hands moved on their own. Antiseptic wipe across his chest. The pericardiocentesis needle, 14-gauge catheter angiocath, cool and bright under the fluorescent lights. She found the space between ribs, 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line. The angle was muscle memory. The pressure check was instinct. The hiss of air escaping as she withdrew the syringe, that sound was home. Dark blood came back. 200 milliliters. Then 300. The pressure releasing like a valve opening. The monitor climbed. BP rising. 65/42. 70/45. 80/50. The oxygen saturation crept upward, 78, 82, 88. The tachycardia slowed. Settled. Found rhythm. Harold Chen's eyes focused. He gasped once, hard, like a man surfacing from underwater. His daughter sobbed and gripped his hand. The other nurses stood frozen, watching a procedure they'd never seen performed outside an OR, watching their quiet colleague move like someone who'd done this in worse places, under worse pressure, in the kind of darkness that doesn't exist in Portland hospitals. By 2:48 a.m., Harold was stable. By 3:53 a.m., he was heading to cardiothoracic surgery. By 4:15 a.m., Dr. Hargrove arrived. He didn't examine the patient. He didn't review the chart. He walked directly to Danielle at the medication cart, and his voice was loud enough for the entire unit to hear, the night clerk at reception, the 2 residents charting at the desk, the family members still lingering in the waiting room. Nurse Ross. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. This is exactly the kind of cowboy medicine that kills patients. The ward went quiet. Someone's keyboard stopped clicking. A monitor beeped in the distance like punctuation to a sentence already ending. Danielle took one measured breath. Her hands continued organizing the medication cups in front of her. But her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she turned to face him, one tear had already escaped, just one, tracking down her cheek with the precision of a sniper's shot, before she locked her composure back down so tight you could hear the mechanism click. She maintained eye contact. Her voice, when it came, was devastatingly calm. His blood pressure was 60/40 and dropping. His heart was full of blood. 40 more seconds and it would have stopped. She paused. I did what the patient needed. Protocol exists for a reason, Hargrove said, but his eyes had narrowed. He wasn't expecting pushback. He wasn't expecting her to look at him like she was cataloguing his weaknesses, with a slight flush in his neck, the tremor in his fingers, the way his voice had risen a half octave when she'd contradicted him. He turned to Harold's daughter, who was standing 5 feet away holding her father's chart. I apologize that our overeager staff member put your father at risk with her recklessness. We have protocols for cardiac tamponade, and they involve physician-led teams in controlled environments. The daughter's face shifted from confusion to cold fury. This nurse just saved my father's life. Your protocol would have let him die in my driveway. Hargrove walked away without responding. But his phone was already in his pocket, and Danielle knew, in the way you know things when you've spent 12 years reading threat assessments and tactical positions, that she'd just made an enemy who had institutional power. Not the kind that fades. The kind that plots. The kind that has networks and favors and board members on speed dial. The break room became a geography of exile over the next 7 days. Danielle would sit at the corner table with her lunch, and the conversation would stop like someone had cut the audio feed. Nurses would grab their sandwiches and drift out, one by one, murmuring excuses about charting or checking on patients. By the time she'd unwrapped her food, the room would be empty except for the fluorescent hum and the industrial refrigerator cycling on. She ate alone. Cold sandwich. Lukewarm coffee. The hospital newsletter open in front of her, though she never turned the pages. Just sat there with her hands flat on the table, breathing in the smell of disinfectant that had seeped into the walls, refusing to acknowledge what was happening even as it happened. One tear, maybe, on the 4th day when she found the shift rotation posted without her name. She wiped it with the back of her hand, took one measured breath, and finished eating in the silence. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining felt like it was burning. By day 8, the disciplinary notice appeared on the unit board where the staff gathered for shift change. It was printed on official hospital letterhead. Not handwritten. Not informal. Not the kind of thing that could be explained away as a miscommunication. Typed. Laminated. Pinned directly above the holiday schedule where everyone would see it. Written warning, employee conduct violation. Employee, Nurse Danielle Ross. Date of incident, the 14th of July, 2024, 2:14 to 2:33 a.m. Violation, failure to follow chain of command pattern of insubordination. The written warning was still taped to the break room bulletin board when the ambulance radio crackled at 11:19 p.m. 3 nights had passed since the paratrooper arrived. 3 nights of Danielle checking his vitals, adjusting his drip rate, watching the swelling in his brain slowly retreat as the pressure normalized. Marcus Webb was stable now, still in the ICU, still groggy, but the seizures had stopped. His 10-year-old son had visited that evening with the boy's mother, and Danielle had stepped back, invisible as always, while they held his hand and told him he was going to be fine. She was completing the midnight vital signs when the first shot cracked through the ER entrance like a whip. The sound wasn't loud, wasn't what most people imagined gunfire to be. It was sharper. Meaner. The fluorescent lights above her head flickered once. A coffee cup on the nurse's station shattered. Then a voice, rough and hunting, "Where's the soldier? Where's Webb? I know he came through here." Danielle's hands didn't hesitate. Muscle memory doesn't ask permission. She was already moving toward Marcus's bed before conscious thought caught up, her body responding to a language she'd learned in Tikrit, the dialect of incoming fire and the arithmetic of survival. The monitors above Marcus's head beat their steady rhythm, oblivious to the new threat moving through the corridors. Webb? I'm gonna gut him like his brother should have been gutted. Security hadn't reached the shooter yet. Danielle could hear their radios crackling, could hear the administrator fumbling for the panic button. None of that mattered. What mattered was the gurney beneath her hands, the young man still half sedated in the bed, the hallway that led directly here from the ER entrance. She shoved the bed hard. The wheel screamed against the tile floor like something dying. Behind the supply cart. That was the only cover, 3 feet of metal shelving stacked with rolled bandages and for tubing and expired saline bags. Not much. Never enough. But it was what existed. Marcus's eyes flew open. What? Stay down. The gunman rounded the corner. He was lean, maybe 30, his face twisted with the particular fury of someone who'd been waiting 3 days to pull a trigger. The shotgun came up level with the cart where Marcus had been a second before. The muzzle flashed orange. Deafening. The blast shredded through drywall and supply boxes and the dreams of a woman who'd already died once in a country that had no record of her death. The shrapnel caught Danielle across the left shoulder and side, hot metal moving faster than thought, faster than flinch. It wasn't pain at first. It was information. Tactile data screaming at her nervous system in a language older than speech. The impact spun her sideways, slammed her ribs against the metal cart frame, and when she looked down there was blood, her blood, spreading across white tile like something alive, pooling beneath her, bright red and unforgiving. Her left arm didn't work anymore. Didn't want to. The nerves there were screaming what amounted to "do not use this component," but there was a neck wound bleeding from Marcus's carotid artery and there was exactly one person in this hospital who understood the mathematics of pressure and time and the precise geometry of staying alive. She grabbed gauze with her right hand. Her vision was already starting to tunnel at the edges, blood loss talking, oxygen saturation dropping, her body preparing for shock the way bodies do. But muscle memory doesn't require oxygen. It requires repetition and consequence, and she'd had both in abundance. "Stay with me, soldier," she whispered, pressing the gauze to his neck with a pressure that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "Stay with me. Stay. With me." Her left shoulder was useless. Her left hand hung at her side like a failed piece of equipment. The floor was tilting slightly, the way floors do when a person is hemorrhaging faster than her vascular system can compensate. But her right hand was steady as a surgical laser, pressing, controlling, keeping the bleed localized while Marcus's eyes went wide with the realization that the nurse who'd been invisible to everyone else had just become very visible to him, visible as something other than a nurse. Boots on tile. Security moving fast. The shooter crumpling as 2 guards brought him down, the shotgun clattering away across the floor. Shouting. Overhead paging code she could hear but no longer fully process. The world narrowing to her hand and Marcus's carotid and the blood and the count, keep pressure, count seconds, stay aware, stay. "Reaper," she whispered as the paramedics appeared above her, as they were moving her onto a gurney, as her vision finally gave up and the lights went away. One word. Just one. But Marcus Webb heard it from his bed, and his body went rigid. His monitors spiked, heart rate climbing, blood pressure spiking. "Reaper," he repeated, and he was crying, actually crying, because a Navy corpsman named Senior Chief Mendez, callsign Reaper, had held his entire unit alive through an ambush in Fallujah in 2009, had performed a field thoracotomy with a dive knife while under fire, had carried him out on her back when his leg was shattered. And that woman had been erased. That woman had disappeared into a classified extraction that left no paperwork, no shadow, no proof she'd ever existed. Until tonight. Until the moment that woman had taken shrapnel meant for him and whispered her own call sign like a prayer. Dr. Hargrove arrived in the trauma bay exactly 4 minutes later, stepping through the doors with the confident stride of a man who'd learned to turn chaos into opportunity. He saw Danielle on the gurney, pale, bleeding, left arm shredded, a uniform darkened with blood the color of rust and ending. He saw the monitors. He saw the liability walking in on a stretcher. And he saw the moment to finish what he'd started. Before the trauma team had even cut her clothes away, before anyone had assessed the full extent of her injuries, he was in the hallway with his phone. His voice was smooth as oil, pitched to sound concerned, professional, deeply regretful about having to raise concerns during a crisis. The hospital board president answered on the second ring. "Jennifer, we have a situation. The nurse involved in the shooting, Danielle Ross, she violated our evacuation protocols. She didn't leave her post. She remained in an active threat zone when she should have taken shelter. I'm going to need an outside investigator to review her conduct during the incident." The lie was so elegant it was almost beautiful. The truth, that she'd saved a patient's life while bleeding out, was still bleeding on the other side of those doors. But truth and narrative are not the same thing, and Hargrove understood that the narrative of her recklessness, her insubordination, her refusal to follow chain of command, was already written. Already posted on the break room board for everyone to see. He made 3 more calls in the parking lot while rain began to fall. One to her listed references, planting questions about her stability, her judgment, her history of acting alone without authorization. One to a private investigator who specialized in background checks. One to the hospital's legal team, suggesting that her medical decisions during the shooting might warrant a formal review. By the time Danielle lost consciousness completely, the machinery of her destruction was already in motion. Not crude. Not loud. Just the sound of a man with institutional power and institutional access, making phone calls and building a case that would, by morning, transform a hero into a liability. 3 nights later, the ER doors burst open at 11:41 p.m. and the gunman didn't announce himself. He just walked in like he owned the place, .45 caliber pistol raised, eyes scanning the trauma bay with the focused intensity of a man looking for one specific face. Marcus Webb. The kid who'd testified against his brother. The kid who dared to say the name out loud in a courtroom where judges and lawyers had written it down and made it permanent. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual mechanical prayer, indifferent to the fact that everything was about to change. Danielle was restocking the crash cart on Bay 3, her hands moving through the familiar motions, epinephrine here, atropine there, the rhythm of the night shift coded into muscle memory. She heard the doors first. Then the shouting. Then the sound that turned her stomach to stone, the crack of the first shot, so loud it rewrote the entire acoustic landscape of the ER. The bullet went through a monitor and the monitor exploded into plastic and sparks. Nurse's dove. A resident froze. The waiting room erupted into screams that sounded like 1,000 birds dying at once. Marcus was in Bay 4, post-op from the shoulder reconstruction, still groggy from the anesthesia that was supposed to keep him unconscious for another 6 hours. The gunman was maybe 30 feet from his bed. Danielle didn't calculate odds. She didn't assess threat vectors or call for security. Her body moved like it had been waiting for this exact moment since the day she'd taken her oath to put patients before protocols. She was across the ER in 3 strides. Her hand hit the gurney's brake release. She pivoted it sideways with the fluid precision of someone who'd moved wounded bodies under actual fire, and the 1,300-pound bed slid behind the supply cart just as the second shot ripped through the space where Marcus's head had been milliseconds before. The third shot was meant for her. It came from the gunman's adjusted aim, a wide arc that was supposed to take down whatever nurse had just made the save. The shrapnel from the bullet's path through the supply cart was what got her 17 distinct pieces of jagged metal that carried the bullet's momentum like tiny secondary projectiles. One through her deltoid. One glancing off her scapula. 2 more ripping through her lateral rib cage. The pain was absolute, white-hot, a sensation that rewrote her entire understanding of what tissue could feel. She went down on one knee. Blood soaked through her scrubs. Her vision grayed at the edges. And she didn't let go of Marcus's neck. Her right hand was already there, pressed against the arterial bleeding from the wound the gunman's first shot had opened in the boy's carotid when he thrashed on the bed. Blood was running between her fingers in a steady stream that looked black under the harsh trauma lights. Her vision was blurring, her shoulder screaming messages her brain couldn't process fast enough, but her left hand, the one that should have been reaching for the call button or pressing on her own wounds, stayed exactly where it was. Gauze. Pressure. Count of 10. Check for spurting. Find the rhythm of keeping a human being alive while your own body is trying to shut down. Stay with me, she whispered to Marcus, not loud enough for anyone else to hear except the kid whose eyes were rolling back, whose pupils were dilating from shock. I've got you. Security was moving then, 3 officers with radios crackling urgently, and the gunman was pivoting to face them because that's what killers do when they realize their original target isn't going to happen. He fired twice more, missed twice, and then the officers had him on the ground in a tangle of restraint and rage. The ER descended into controlled chaos, Bay 1 flooding with cops, Bay 2 becoming a temporary ICU, the waiting room being evacuated by hospital security moving with the brisk precision of people who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Danielle stayed on her knee. Stayed with her hand on Marcus's wound. Stayed until another nurse, someone with a last name Danielle would never quite remember, took over the pressure and gently, with a respect that made her throat tight, guided her toward Bay 2 where they could see how much of her had been torn open. She whispered one word to Marcus before she lost consciousness to the morphine and the weight of her own shock, Reaper. Just her call sign. Just the sound of a woman whose military identity and civilian life had just occupied the same moment in front of witnesses and security cameras and a hospital full of people who would remember exactly what her hands had done. What happened next didn't unfold like a normal recovery. Danielle woke up in the ICU 3 days later with 17 pieces of shrapnel removed from her shoulder and side, her rotator cuff reconstructed, her ribs wrapped tight, and Dr. Hargrove standing beside her bed like a funeral director sizing up his next commission. His suit was pressed. His tie was exactly the right shade of navy blue. His smile was the kind of smile that had probably looked good in the mirror for about 2 seconds before he practiced it enough times to perfection. "I'm terribly sorry, Nurse Ross," he said, and the way he said terribly suggested he'd practiced this apology 100 times in different mirrors with different lighting. "But the board has made their decision regarding your employment status." Security guards stood in the doorway behind him. 2 of them. Men with radios and the kind of neutral expressions that meant they'd already been briefed. Already knew what was coming. Danielle's good hand reached instinctively for something to grip, the call button, the bed rail, anything. Her shoulder was a cathedral of pain. Her mind was still caught in the fog of post-operative drugs and the strange clarity that comes from nearly dying. She could feel the patches of reconstructed tissue, could sense the surgeon's work like a foreign landscape inside her own body. "The patient lived," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, a sound like something dragged across pavement. "That's all that matters." One tear escaped. She didn't reach to wipe it away because reaching hurt and because showing weakness in front of Dr. Hargrove felt like handing him a loaded gun. She kept her eyes on the ceiling instead. "That's exactly the attitude that makes you dangerous," Hargrove said, and there was something almost impressed in his tone, the way a man might admire a beautiful knife before using it to cut you open. "Your pattern of reckless behavior and disregard for institutional safety protocols during the active shooter event represents unacceptable liability. Effective immediately, your employment with Sacred Heart Hospital is terminated. You'll be receiving the official letter tomorrow. Security will escort you from the premises once you're discharged. I hope you understand this isn't personal." It was exactly personal. It was the most personal thing he'd ever done. 3 days later, Danielle stood at the bus stop on Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland, and the rain was the kind of rain that didn't just fall, it interrogated. It soaked through her jacket and clung to her hair and made rivulets down the cardboard box she was holding like it was the only thing keeping her from dissolving entirely. The box contained everything her life at Sacred Heart had accumulated: a cracked mug from a conference in Seattle, a dying succulent that she'd bought to give the apartment something alive to care for, and a photograph of her Tikrit squad from 2009, their faces arranged in 3 rows of 8 people each, and half those faces, for across the top, the medic she'd replaced, 2 from 3rd Squad, and the chaplain who'd driven over an IED the following month, had been crossed out by death, their eyes obscured with permanent marker the way you mark casualties on a roster. The bus was 3 minutes late. She could see it 2 blocks down, moving with the grinding patience of something that had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Her fingers found the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, and she let them trace the embroidered eagle and trident, the letters so worn they were almost illegible. This was the only proof Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had ever existed at all. Not the medals locked in a storage unit under a false name. Not the discharge papers filed under classification codes and redaction marks. Not the 17 lives she'd kept from bleeding out in Iraq, or the 40 minutes she'd held an arterial spray closed with both hands while walking through darkness that would have killed a normal person. Just this. A patch. Faded. Hidden. Waiting for someone to notice. Back in his office on the 4th floor, Dr. Hargrove watched her from the window, and his jaw was tight with something between satisfaction and rage. She was gone. The threat had been removed. The liability had been excised. He picked up his phone and dialed the IT department with the authority of a man who'd spent 3 decades learning how to make problems disappear. "Chen, it's Hargrove. I need you to delete all security footage from the ER shooting 3 days ago. Storage issue. Backup corruption. I don't care what you tell the other departments. Just get it done. Today." He hung up without waiting for confirmation because he didn't expect confirmation. He expected obedience. But downstairs, in a server room that smelled like machine oil and electricity, Marine veteran Marcus Chen was already 3 steps ahead. He'd watched the security footage the moment the HIPAA alarms had stopped screaming. He'd watched a nurse who moved like a ghost, with hands that were too precise, with knowledge of anatomy and pressure points that no civilian nurse should have possessed. He'd watched her take a blast meant for a kid with a sealed testimony and a target on his back. And when his phone buzzed with Dr. Hargrove's order, Chen didn't delete anything. Instead, he pulled out a cold external hard drive from his desk drawer and began copying every frame, every angle, every moment of Danielle Ross saving a life and then being cast out for it. His jaw was tight. His hands were steady. His rage was the kind of rage that had been trained into him for 22 years and was now, finally, looking for a target worthy of its precision. The rain kept falling on the cardboard box. The bus kept approaching. And 100 miles northeast, in a barracks at Fort Lewis, young soldiers were making phone calls to old squad leaders, and old squad leaders were making phone calls to their old commanding officers, and the chain of contact that had been severed when Danielle's records were erased was being rewoven one thread at a time. The morning came quiet and cold, the kind of Portland rain that fell sideways through the gutters. Danielle sat on her apartment steps with a cup of coffee going grey, watching the parking lot like someone waiting for a bus that would never come. Her shoulder throbbed in a way that had nothing to do with the surgical incisions underneath the bandages. The painkiller should have worked. It wasn't working. A car pulled in at 6:47 in the morning. A boy stepped out first, 10 years old in khakis and a polo shirt, holding a manila folder against his chest like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Behind him came a sedan. Then a truck. Then another. And another. The parking lot began to fill. Not gradually. All at once. Like someone had opened a floodgate. The boy approached slowly, his sneakers crunching on gravel that shouldn't have been crunching at this hour. His hands were trembling. The folder was trembling. His voice came out in a whisper that broke across every other word. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross," he began, reading haltingly from the papers in front of him. "My dad said I should read this to you. He said you deserved to hear it out loud." Behind the boy, they came up the stairs. Dozens of them. Then 100. Men and women in dress uniforms, blue so dark they looked like the sky before a thunderstorm, dress whites with the precision of soldiers who'd learned that a crease was a form of respect. They filled the parking lot. They lined the stairs. They stood in the hallway outside her apartment door, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air, waiting. The boy's voice steadied as he read from the folder, and it was Marcus's voice now, borrowing the precision of his son's youth to say the things he couldn't say himself. 3 bronze stars, the child read. His father stood behind him on crutches, unable to step forward, watching his boy deliver what amounted to a resurrection. Purple Heart. Navy Cross for extracting 12 wounded under fire in Tikrit. Danielle's coffee cup slipped from her good hand. It shattered on the concrete. Neither of them moved. She whispered Reaper when the shrapnel hit, Marcus said, his voice breaking behind his son's shoulder. That was her call sign. That was the medic who saved my entire unit in 2009. That was Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. A SEAL team leader stepped forward, and the uniform he wore had been stitched together by someone who understood that fabric could hold ceremony. His voice came out clear and measured, the kind of voice that had given orders in 8 different languages and been obeyed without question every single time. Senior Chief Ross held a severed artery closed for 40 minutes, he said, his eyes locked on Danielle like she was the only person in the parking lot. While carrying a wounded operator through enemy fire. Then performed a field thoracotomy with a dive knife. And the Pentagon buried it all when the mission was scrubbed from existence. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something, witness, perhaps. Recognition. The weight of 100 people finally seeing what had been invisible for so long. A car pulled up at the far end of the lot. Dr. Hargrove emerged, his jaw already working, already reaching for his phone. He took 3 steps before he saw the uniforms. His pace slowed. His hand dropped. The phone stayed in his pocket. I'm calling the police, he said anyway, but the words came out like something rehearsed and meaningless. This is harassment. This is threatening behavior toward a member of the Dr. Hargrove. The voice came from inside the crowd, and Chen emerged in dress blue so crisp they looked like they'd never been worn. Chen was a Marine, the kind of Marine that carried a keyboard like other Marines carried rifles, equally comfortable with both. His face was the color of someone who'd spent 6 months in a desert and another 6 months understanding exactly what Hargrove had done. He held a hard drive the size of a deck of cards. Everything you ordered deleted, Chen said, and his voice had the flat precision of evidence being logged. Every security footage. Every frame showing you tampering with records. 15 months of emails. Phantom procedures. Inflated supply orders. Kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives totaling $340,000. Hargrove's face went crimson like a warning light. You have no authority. I'm obligated to inform you that I've already submitted everything to the FBI, the State Medical Board, and the hospital's board of directors. Chen didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. They executed a warrant for your office an hour ago. An unmarked sedan was already pulling up. 2 FBI agents in dark suits, moving with the easy purpose of people who'd made this walk 1,000 times. One was a woman with eyes the color of courtroom testimony. The other was older, with hands that had done this enough times to know exactly how tight the cuffs needed to be. They took Hargrove's arms like they were handling hazardous material. He was still screaming as they guided him toward the car. She violated protocols. She performed unauthorized procedures. She's a liability. She's a security risk. You're making a mistake, you're all making a Navy commander stepped forward, and her presence moved the air like the approach of weather. Her rank insignia caught the morning light. Her voice came out ice-cold and precise. Senior Chief Ross saved more lives in 6 months in Tikrit than you'll see in your entire career, she said, her words landing like charges being read. And she did it while people were actively trying to kill her. Not just people trying to protect their fraud scheme. 3 hospital board members arrived then, the ones who'd supported Danielle's termination, who'd signed off on Hargrove's narrative without questioning it. They watched from the far end of the parking lot as agents read charges: insurance fraud, falsifying medical records, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice. Hargrove was loaded into the sedan, screaming about lawyers, about appeals, about his Rolex catching light as his hands were cuffed behind his back. Chen handed the hard drive to an FBI agent and turned to Danielle. He saluted, his fist crossing his chest, the sound of it crisp and final. She returned the salute with her good arm, and the tears came then, not the tears of someone breaking, but the kind of tears that come when weight is finally lifted, when the thing you've been carrying alone is suddenly shared by 100 people who understand exactly what it meant to carry it. Marcus's son walked over, and in his small hands was something faded by sand and blood and 13 years of being kept safe. A unit patch. The one from her jacket lining, the one she'd sewn in herself during a sandstorm in Fallujah when she was someone else entirely. The boy pinned it to her scrub shirt with the gravity of someone performing a ceremony that mattered more than any funeral or wedding he'd ever attended. The 100 soldiers still stood at attention behind her, a wall of witness that would hold this moment forever. 2 years later, the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart Hospital was transformed. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows like permission to begin again. The Veteran Care Unit occupied the entire wing, and Director Danielle Ross, wearing scrubs with her rank insignia finely visible on the collar, reviewed charts with a team of former combat medics she'd personally recruited. 18 of them now, all carrying the same muscle memory of saving lives under conditions that civilians could barely imagine. On her office wall hung a framed photograph, 100 soldiers standing at attention in an apartment parking lot at dawn. Beside it, the faded unit patch, finally home. Marcus Webb visited that afternoon with his son, who was 12 now and wearing a junior ROTC uniform like it was armor that actually fit. His frame had grown into something like his father's, same jaw, same eyes that had learned to see the world clearly. "Chief Ross, he got accepted," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of pride that comes from watching your child understand what courage actually means. "The Military Youth Leadership Program." She shook the boy's hand, and he stood straighter because she was looking at him like she recognized something in him that maybe he hadn't recognized in himself yet. Through the office window, she could see across the street to the strip mall, where a folding table sat outside a discount store. Dr. Hargrove was there, in a cheap polyester polo, talking to someone who was avoiding eye contact. His Rolex was long gone. He'd sold it to pay for lawyers who couldn't save him anyway. Chen stopped by with coffee at the end of the day. He was Chief Information Officer now, which meant he got to spend his days making sure the right people knew the right things and the wrong people were held accountable. He glanced out the window with Danielle, following her gaze to that folding table. "Parole got denied again," Chen said quietly. "Turns out defrauding the VA specifically doesn't go over well with parole boards full of veterans." Danielle touched the framed patch, and for a moment she was back in the desert, holding a wound closed while rounds kicked up dust around her boots, 12 faces looking back at her, and now half of them only lived in memory. Some people think medicine is about status and money, she thought. They forget it's about showing up when someone's bleeding. About doing what needs to be done. About the faces you save and the ones you can't, and somehow finding a way to honor both. "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns," she said, and it wasn't a whisper anymore. The rain came that evening, the kind of Portland rain that sounded like applause against the windows, and in the 3rd-floor hallway, a veteran who'd lost part of his leg in Marja Province sat in a wheelchair reviewing his discharge plan with a former combat medic, and neither of them had to explain to the other why they understood that survival sometimes meant more than staying alive. It meant coming home to a place where someone finally saw you. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, if you've ever stayed silent while being treated unfairly, if you've ever wondered whether speaking up was worth the cost, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Like this video and comment below. What would you have done in Danielle's position? Would you have kept your head down, or would you have let your competence speak for itself? Your stories matter. Share them with us.